Marcus Carter had always felt a strange sense of displacement whenever he returned to his hometown, a place where familiarity intertwined with an undercurrent of quiet hostility. The years he had spent in Washington, D.C., serving his country in ways most people could never fathom, had changed him, refined him, but the moment he crossed the county line into this small southern town, he was once again just another black man in a place that had never truly accepted him. The sun hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the cracked pavement as he pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside cafe. The kind of place that had probably looked exactly the same for the past 30 years. Faded signs, a few rusting pickup trucks, and a rickety wooden bench out front where old men sat, watching the world go by with narrowed eyes. As he stepped out of his sleek, black SUV, the weight of a dozen silent stares settled on his shoulders. He ignored them, his focus solely on the promise of a strong cup of coffee before continuing his drive. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to his skin like an unwanted embrace. He adjusted his jacket, ran a hand over his closely cropped hair, and started toward the entrance, his boots echoing against the asphalt. That was when he noticed the police cruiser parked diagonally near the entrance, its engine idling as if waiting for trouble to materialize. And sure enough, as he reached the door, he heard the sharp, deliberate sound of a car door slamming shut. "Hey, you!" Marcus paused, suppressing the sigh that threatened to escape. He turned slowly, his gaze locking onto the figure of Officer Brad Turner, a man whose reputation preceded him. Turner was a broad-shouldered, thick-necked embodiment of small-town authority, his uniform pressed to perfection, his mirrored sunglasses concealing whatever expression lay beneath. He walked with the casual arrogance of someone who had spent years being obeyed without question. His thumbs hooked into the belt that supported his holstered firearm and a baton worn smooth from overuse. Marcus said nothing as Turner approached, his posture relaxed but his mind already running through the possible outcomes of this encounter. "You got some ID on you?" Turner asked, his voice laced with an edge that suggested this was not a request. Marcus didn't flinch. "Is there a reason you're asking?" His tone was even, devoid of hostility but firm enough to assert that he would not be intimidated. Turner's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yeah, reason is I don't recognize you, and I make it a point to know everyone in this town." Marcus resisted the urge to laugh. It was the same tired routine, the same veil of authority draped over something far uglier. "I grew up here," he said, keeping his voice measured. "Left for a while. Now I'm back for a visit." Turner's fingers tapped idly against the buckle of his belt. "That's so? Mighty nice car you got there. Fancy for someone just passing through." And there it was, the implication, the unspoken accusation that a black man in a luxury SUV had to be up to something. Marcus had encountered men like Turner before, men who wore their biases like second skins, who wielded authority like a blunt instrument. He had spent years working in intelligence, had stood in rooms with world leaders, had made decisions that affected national security, and yet here he was, standing in a dusty parking lot, being reduced to nothing more than a suspicion in the eyes of a man who knew nothing about him. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his driver's license, but nothing else. The badge that rested in a separate compartment remained concealed. Turner barely glanced at the ID before snatching it out of his hand, scrutinizing it with unnecessary intensity. "You mind telling me what you're really doing here?" Turner asked after a long pause, as if Marcus's answer hadn't been sufficient. Marcus clenched his jaw for a moment before forcing himself to exhale slowly. "I already told you, getting coffee. Unless that's a crime now." Turner's posture stiffened, and for a brief second, Marcus saw it. The flicker of irritation, of something darker simmering just beneath the surface. Turner had expected compliance, deference, maybe even fear. What he had not anticipated was defiance wrapped in composure. "You carrying anything I should know about?" Turner asked, shifting tactics. "Drugs, weapons?" Marcus' patience thinned. "No." Turner took a slow step closer, tilting his head slightly. "Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" Marcus held his gaze. "I do mind, actually, unless you have a warrant." The air between them crackled with tension. A few of the onlookers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring, their expressions varying from mild curiosity to quiet unease. Turner exhaled sharply through his nose, looking Marcus up and down like he was something that had crawled out of the wrong neighborhood. "See, now you're making me real suspicious. Most folks around here don't got a problem showing they got nothing to hide." Marcus folded his arms across his chest. "Most folks around here don't get stopped for no reason." A muscle in Turner's jaw ticked. His hand hovered near the radio clipped to his shoulder, as if contemplating calling for backup. Marcus wasn't sure if the man was itching for a confrontation or just wanted to make an example out of him. Either way, this wasn't going to end easily. "Step over to the car," Turner finally ordered. Marcus remained still. "I don't think so." Turner took another step forward, his stance shifting, his authority pressing down like an iron weight. "That wasn't a request." And in that moment, Marcus saw it, the inevitability of where this was heading. He had seen it too many times before, in different places with different faces, but always the same story. And yet, he wasn't just another statistic. He wasn't just a man at the mercy of a badge and a gun. He was something Turner could never have guessed. But for now, he played the part. Because soon, very soon, the game was going to change. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an invisible force. A slow-burning tension that coiled in his chest as Officer Turner's stance shifted from casual antagonism to something far more deliberate. The air around them had thickened, the idle hum of crickets and distant highway noise fading into the background as the eyes of the gathered onlookers bore into the scene. Some watched with mild curiosity, others with the kind of wary detachment that came from knowing how these encounters usually ended. Turner let out a slow exhale, tapping his fingers against the baton on his belt. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of expectation, as if he had already decided that Marcus's compliance was the only acceptable outcome. Marcus remained still for a moment longer than necessary, just enough to make it clear that he was not intimidated, before finally reaching for the door handle. He moved deliberately, not out of fear but out of experience, because he knew men like Turner thrived on excuses, on any slight motion they could twist into a justification for violence. He stepped out of the SUV, standing his full height, and even though he wasn't trying to, he could tell by the way Turner's fingers twitched near his holster that he felt threatened. Turner's eyes swept over him, scanning for anything. Any bulge in his jacket, any sign of resistance. "Hands where I can see them," he said, the authority in his voice sharpened by the slight edge of frustration. Marcus raised his hands slightly, keeping his palms open. "You still haven't told me what crime I've committed," he said evenly, his voice unwavering. Turner scoffed. "Loitering. Suspicious activity. Take your pick." Marcus let out a slow breath through his nose. "Loitering? In a public parking lot. You arguing with me?" Turner's stance shifted forward, his chest puffing slightly as if to make himself appear bigger. He was looking for an escalation, pushing buttons, waiting for Marcus to flinch, to give him any reason to take this further. Marcus didn't flinch. Turner's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smirk. He lifted his radio, clicking the button with a deliberate slowness. "Dispatch, I've got a possible hostile individual here. Going to need some backup." The words landed like a punch to the gut, not because Marcus was afraid, but because he knew exactly what was happening. It was a script as old as time. Stack the deck, paint him as a threat, and make sure there were enough officers present so that, when things inevitably went south, no one could question whether force had been necessary. He forced himself to remain still, even as the sick feeling of inevitability curled in his gut. Turner's backup would arrive soon, and when they did, things would spiral in the exact way Turner wanted them to. Across the lot, a few people shifted uncomfortably. An older white man in a baseball cap frowned slightly, as if he was debating whether to speak up. But in the end, he simply shook his head and turned away. A woman in a sundress held her phone at waist level, not recording, but watching carefully, her grip tightening around the device as if she was contemplating whether or not to intervene. Marcus had seen this before. People witnessing injustice but hesitating, torn between discomfort and self-preservation. The radio crackled. "Copy that, Turner. 2 units en route." Turner smirked. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had dealt with worse. He had faced down threats most people couldn't fathom, had stood his ground in war rooms where the wrong decision meant lives lost. But this was different, because no matter how much he had accomplished, no matter how far he had come, moments like this reminded him that in the eyes of men like Turner, he would always be nothing more than a problem waiting to be dealt with. Turner took a step closer, invading Marcus's space, his voice lowering to something almost conversational. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Marcus met his gaze. "I think I know exactly what kind of man you are." Turner's jaw tightened. He reached for Marcus's shoulder, gripping the fabric of his jacket with unnecessary force as he turned him toward the car. "Hands on the vehicle. Now." Marcus exhaled through his nose, fighting the anger rising in his chest. He could end this right now. He could flash the badge in his pocket, say a single word, and watch as Turner's face crumbled with the realization of what he had done. But he didn't. Not yet. Because he wasn't alone. Because Turner wasn't the only one who had called for backup. And when they arrived, everything was going to change. Marcus could feel the shift in the air before he even heard the vehicle approaching. The distant hum of an engine grew louder, the deep purr of something powerful rolling to a controlled stop at the curb. Turner was too focused on asserting his dominance to notice at first, but Marcus caught the flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. The sleek black SUV, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing red and blue lights from Turner's squad car. The door opened with a measured precision, and then they stepped out. A team of men in dark suits, their movements crisp and calculated, their eyes scanning the scene with a quiet intensity. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The sheer presence of them commanded attention, an unspoken authority that made the air feel suddenly charged with something far heavier than Turner's petty aggression. One of them, a man with neatly cropped hair and a presence that spoke of years of discipline, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Without breaking stride, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open with a motion so practiced it was second nature. The golden emblem caught the streetlights, glinting unmistakably. "Take your hands off our agent." The words were delivered with a calmness that sent an immediate ripple through the scene. Turner froze, his grip on Marcus's jacket going slack as his brain scrambled to process what had just been said. His face went pale, the bravado draining out of him in real time as his gaze darted between Marcus and the man standing before him. The other officers had arrived by then, 2 additional patrol cars pulling up, their occupants stepping out with hands already hovering near their holsters, ready to escalate before even understanding the situation. But now, with the sight of the badge, with the realization of who they had just laid hands on, the tension in their stance shifted from aggression to unease. Turner swallowed hard. What? His voice, so firm just moments ago, now carried an unmistakable tremor. Marcus straightened his jacket, brushing off the spot where Turner had grabbed him, and turned to face him fully. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the situation to fully sink in before he finally spoke. "You really should have asked for my ID." Turner's jaw clenched, but there was no more fight left in his eyes. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. The agent in the dark suit took another step forward, his posture unwavering. "Do you realize what you've just done?" His voice was measured, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of authority. One of the newly arrived officers, probably realizing that his career was on the line, stepped in hastily. "Look, there's obviously been a misunderstanding." Marcus let out a slow exhale. "No misunderstanding," he said coolly. "Your officer profiled me, assumed I didn't belong here, and decided to escalate without cause. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice." Turner's face darkened, but he said nothing. There was no defense he could offer that wouldn't sound hollow. The agent snapped his badge holder shut. "We'll be filing a report," he said, his gaze flicking toward the body cameras that every officer in the vicinity now seemed hyper-aware of. "You'll be hearing from the proper authorities." The weight of those words landed with an almost physical impact. The officers shifted uneasily, but no one dared to protest. Marcus turned back to Turner one last time, holding his gaze. Next time you see a black man in a nice car, think twice before assuming you know his place. Then, without another word, he walked past them, toward the black SUV where his team was waiting. The doors opened, swallowing him into the safety of men who understood his worth. And as they drove away, he didn't look back. Marcus sat in silence as the SUV moved smoothly through the city streets, the tinted windows shielding him from the world outside. The weight of what had just happened still pressed against his chest, not because he was surprised. He had seen men like Turner before, had dealt with their assumptions, their arrogance, their unchecked authority that so easily turned into violence. But this time, there had been consequences. This time, Turner wasn't going to walk away with nothing more than a smug grin and a bruised ego. This time, justice had stepped in before the damage was irreversible. The lead agent, Carter, sat across from him, watching him with a measured gaze. "You okay?" he finally asked, his voice low, steady. Marcus exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "I should be," he admitted. "But I'm not." Carter nodded, as if he understood exactly what Marcus meant. "It never stops being exhausting, does it?" Marcus let out a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Not when it keeps happening in broad daylight. Not when a badge gives a man the confidence to put his hands on me. In my own city, in front of witnesses, without a second thought." He looked out the window, watching as the blurred lights of the city streaked past. He thought he was untouchable. They always do, until they're not. Carter leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "Turner's done. IA will handle the formal investigation, but between the body cam footage and what we recorded, there's no version of this where he comes out clean." His voice was firm, but Marcus had spent too many years watching the system protect its own to believe in easy victories. "You think they'll actually fire him?" Marcus asked, his tone skeptical. "Or will it be the usual? Suspension with pay, a few months of investigation, then back on the force like nothing happened?" Carter didn't answer right away, but Marcus caught the slight clench of his jaw before he spoke. "We'll make sure that doesn't happen." Marcus studied him for a moment. He trusted Carter, but trust didn't erase history. He had seen officers get away with worse. He had seen men like Turner resurface in another precinct, another state, another position of power. But he also knew that this time, there was too much attention. Too many cameras. Too much irrefutable proof. Maybe this time, things would be different. The car slowed to a stop in front of his building. A sleek high-rise that stood in stark contrast to the hostility he had just faced. He let out a slow breath before reaching for the door handle, pausing only when Carter spoke again. "Marcus." He looked back. "You did the right thing by staying calm." Carter's eyes were serious, unwavering. "But don't think for a second that means you should have had to." Marcus gave a small nod, the weight of those words settling somewhere deep inside him. Then, without another word, he stepped out of the SUV, the night air cool against his skin as he walked toward the entrance of his building. The lobby was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the last hour. The doorman gave him a polite nod as he stepped inside, but Marcus barely registered it. His mind was still replaying everything. Turner's grip on his jacket, the moment of stunned silence when the agents arrived, the flicker of fear in the officer's eyes when he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. By the time he reached his apartment, his body felt heavy, drained. He loosened his tie, tossing it onto the kitchen counter before running a hand over his face. He should have felt victorious. He should have felt relieved. Instead, all he felt was tired, because no matter how many Turners got exposed, there would always be more, and the fight would never really be over.